Friends, welcome to Usanas Dialogues. Today we are going to discuss a very critical issue. As we see this war unfolding in West Asia, things are becoming very critical. As of now, we are going through a phase of ultimatum, which is going to end on 6th of April. And after that, in all likelihood, it seems that the war is going to escalate because the Straits of Hormuz still remains closed and the Iranian regime is left with a lot of courage and a lot of, I would say, resources to continue the fight. At the same time, the Western world, that is the US and Israel, they are also determined to pursue their goals. And to discuss all these issues, we have a very eminent and a very distinguished panel today. And our experts are going to address all these issues and the other issues related to this particular war and its impact on the changing world order. So we have today with us Mr. Imad Kiai. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, sir. Mr. Imad Kiai, is it okay?
Perfect.
Okay. So Mr. Imad is an Iranian analyst. He is the director of Middle East Treaty Organization and a co-author with Mr. Syed Hussain Mousavian of the book A Middle East Free of Weapons of Mass Destruction, a new approach to non-proliferation. He works at the intersection of diplomacy, disarmament, and political risks with a strong focus on promoting a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. Then we have Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya. Ambassador Bhattacharya is a former Indian ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, Turkey, Egypt, and permanent representative to Arab League. He also served as the Secretary Consular, Passport and Overseas Indian Affairs, and Joint Secretary South, where he helped shape India's active East policy and Indo-Pacific engagement. Currently, he serves as a professor of diplomatic practice at the Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University. And we have Burzeen Wagmar with us, who is a senior fellow at Usanas Foundation and a prominent academic and subject matter expert affiliated with SOAS University of London and the European Foundation for South Asian Studies. He specializes in Iranian languages, cultural history, South Asian geopolitics. He is a former visiting India fellow at Royal United Services Institute. So very, very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Imad, I'll begin with you first. And since you are from Iran, you've been dealing with this subject for a long time. I've seen that you speak at various forums. You also write a lot on these issues. So, I mean, what's your take on the current situation? What's your assessment? We'll begin this with this very generic question. After that, I'll get back to some specific ones.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's great to be here with such distinguished panelists and on a topic that both is personal to me, but also I have to put my hat of professionalism. But before I do that, I want to just say that this war has opened up a Pandora's box that has caused such tremendous humanitarian crisis and violence on the innocent people. Because wars, at the end of the day, the biggest casualty of war is the civilians that are stuck in between the decisions of those who have power over them in terms of peace and war. To your question, the assessment of today, before we get that, let's just remember three key points. The war of United States on Iran is a war of choice. There was alternative diplomatic avenues to resolve the issues between the United States and Iran, and they were being conducted at the highest level with the facilitation of the Omani government in Switzerland, in Geneva, and 3 rounds of negotiations really were advancing and on critical issues that were at hand, may that be Iran's nuclear program in terms of enrichment, its highly enriched uranium stockpile, also its future of its nuclear program to remain peaceful, and then as a gateway of such an agreement to open up discussions on other areas of concern, may that be Iran's support for proxies across the region, its missile program, and so forth. So let's go back for a moment that 3 days before started, there was a deal on the table. There were concessions that were made that was on the table. It was a decision of the Trump administration and backed and pushed by the Netanyahu government in Israel to go ahead and inflict a major blow on Iran militarily, with the hope and the false hope of believing that bombs can liberate a nation, that bombs can result in quick regime change. And this fallacy of the lack of understanding of Iran itself, the region, and a will of a nation that may not succumb to such violent actions for many reasons that were given. And those reasons, by the way, keep changing. So it started off by we're trying to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. Okay, Iran has to build nuclear weapons. There was a nuclear deal in 2015 that ensured that. It was a Trump administration version 1 that pulled out of it in 2018. So we see this cascading effect of the belief that might is right. And I think at the onset and at the end of this war, because wars will end, and they will be ended in two ways. Either you annihilate everybody, your enemy, or you sit down around a table and you make a deal. Once this war ends, what implications it will have, not just for Iran, US, and Israel, but across the region and globally, is fundamentally important, because it no longer will be the world that we live in prior to this war. And I say this with the belief that the response that Iran had to the Israeli aggression was primarily to say, we will get the hits, we will absorb the hits, but we will ensure that the cost of this war does not remain within our borders, and it will spread. And I think that's where we are today, that the Iranian retaliation has been based on asymmetric warfare, ensuring that the cost of this war goes and inflicts on energy infrastructure, US military bases across the region, and by doing so, inflict enormous economic and military costs to those who have one way or another seen as a party to this war. We will go into more details on what the implications will be on the humanitarian side, on the environmental side, on the geopolitical side, on the role of energy security, and by extension, many people don't realize that when there's disruption in the energy market, it also causes enormous pressure on food security, on the agricultural sector, on the fertilizers, on the byproducts and petrochemicals products that come from petroleum. So all of these industries are now impacted, and therefore it no longer remains just a siloed impact in West Asia, but I know for a fact that India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and the rest of East Asia and Southeast Asia are also feeling the pressures and the pains of this war economically, politically, and the realignment of the global political order is accelerated. And we see that United States and Israel, by doing this war and opening up this Pandora's box, increasingly are feeling isolated, even amongst their key allies, may that be NATO, may that be the Europeans. And there's been a lot of silence in New Delhi on this war. But even there, we are seeing changes in the language of the Indian government in terms of how they see this war and where it is going. They're believing, maybe at the beginning, that they also would see a quick change, a quick war. And now that it's been dragging on, they're realizing that the calculations have to be recalculated and positions recalibrated. And I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A and further questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Imad. We'll come back to you with more questions about its impact and the spillover in the region and beyond the region. But before I move on to my next speaker, I have two quick questions to you. So before this war, we saw that there were many protests in Iran, and definitely in the Western intelligence and security circles, it was being discussed that the Iranians need Western help, and if it is the best time to intervene, people would revolt against the regime. But after this war started, we have not seen any protests so far. So, what's exactly the reason? I mean, do people see it as some sort of a defensive resistance against the West, or particularly regarding the IRGC leaders, do they have some sort of other strategic expansion objectives also with this war? I mean, how do you look at this? Can you hear me? Hello? You are on mute, Mr. Ahmad. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, would you like me to go? I thought maybe you want to go to the next speakers, or is it
no? I just should I repeat my questions?
No, just quickly, please. Sorry, I thought
Yeah,
maybe going to the next speaker.
Before I go to my next speaker, I just have two quick questions to you. So before this war, we see a huge protest in Iran, and we heard several developments that the Iranian regime was killing innocent protesters, and the whole country was just about to revolt. And in fact, it was being discussed in various think tank and security circles that this is the best time for the Western world, the Americans and Israelis, to send reinforcements and help so that the entire country would rise up in revolt against the regime. But after the war started, we have not come across any protests so far. So within that context, I would really like to know whether the common people, masses, see this war as some kind of a defensive resistance, and at the same time, among the IRGC leadership, do they have also some sort of strategic expansion objectives with this war?
These are two very important questions, and you're correct that prior to this war, there was already a major upheaval inside the country, and the Iranian government response was extremely violent against its own citizens, and thousands of Iranians were killed in cold blood. And we saw the shutting down of the internet and blackouts that, oh, by the way, still continue in this war in terms of communication inside the country and with the rest of the world. There was, again, a false understanding of internal upheaval may result in the need for external intervention. Now, external intervention, unfortunately, in this case, the military option has killed the momentum for the internal domestic opposition to the government, because in a war it's extremely difficult to not only organize, but also as the war progressed within the first few days with the bombing of the girls' school by the United States that killed 168 innocent young girls, that shifted the internal understanding of what this war is about. So while there was some Iranian diaspora and even Iranians inside the country calling for US and even Israel to come and support the liberation of the Iranians and to oust this government, in very quickly, the real reasons for this war came out, and the violence that was inflicted on Iran and on its infrastructure, very quickly, the Iranians realized that it's not about their liberation. The Americans used the same excuse, by the way, in 2003 for their war against Iraq on the WMD component, on the weapons of mass destruction component, to liberate the Iraqis from a dictatorship. The same argument was used in Afghanistan to oust the Taliban and bring again liberation to the Afghani woman. These don't work that way. And we have a track record that shows us that external military intervention to secure democracy or liberation hardly actually works. And in this case, we are seeing the fallout. We're seeing actually the silencing, even further oppression of the Iranian government on the voices of opposition internally. There's further imprisonment. There's even threats by the IRGC. If you come out in the streets, we are treating you as part and parcel of being with the enemy. And therefore, it is extremely sad for me to even observe this, because Iranian people had the agency, had the pathways. When we're talking about opposition in Iran, they were in the millions, and Iranian government is unpopular. But unpopularity does not need or require external war inflicted on the country for that to happen. Trump, by the way, is also very unpopular in the United States. Are we calling for a military intervention in the United States to liberate the American people from this dictatorship? No. So we got to leave it to the people. They have the power to decide the pathways, and the opposition leaders, the ones that, have been basically prepped up, the son of the former Shah of Iran sitting in Washington, or other opposition leaders in the diaspora. This implantment of the choice of a leadership by Western powers on Iran is not going to work. They pulled out 1953 with the ousting of the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and there the CIA and the British implanted the previous Shah. So we know that doesn't work. And the real opposition in Iran are inside the jails of Iran. These are the women activists. These are the political activists. These are the prisoners of conscience. We have the opposition. They're in Iran, not outside. They're not in Tel Aviv. They're not in Washington. They're not in London. No, don't worry about that. The real opposition is inside. And a war shuts down the avenues for the people to come to the streets. And so that, unfortunately, has set back Iran in terms of its ability to craft a pathway for a brighter, more democratic, liberal future. At the same time, though, the war has taken out the supreme leader, key Iranian leadership, the IRGC, military command. It still continues because Iranian political system is a labyrinth. It is not so easy to decipher because it's such a melange, a mix of different political systems in one, with checks and balances that divide centers of power. So by taking out the old leadership, actually the new leadership is even more ferment, is even more revolutionary in terms of upholding and protecting the Iranian sovereignty, independence, and what they believe as is being the pillars of the original revolution, which was to end imperialism and colonialism in terms of a power coming and dictating to Iran what to do with its, foreign policy, domestic policy, energy policy, and so forth. So in the aftermath of this war, my reading is that the IRGC and whatever is left of at the end of this war will actually be thinking about what is the new approaches they can take to actually have a new social contract with the citizens. Because they did do wrong. They did spill civilian blood. But this war is sort of one way a redemption of them protecting the nation and also getting killed in the process. And I believe that there will be a need for a collective, comprehensive, broad-based discussion within Iran following this war on how do we address the real underlying issues, economic, political, social, even environmental, that the Iranians are calling for changes. May that be the mismanagement, may that be the curtailing of civil rights, may that be the other economic concerns that they have. These are legitimate and they need to be addressed. And the best way to do it is not in the middle of a war, but preferably in the aftermath.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Imad. So now let me go to Mr. Burzin Wagmar. Burzin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Burzin. So Mr. Imad said that this is a war of choice, not the war of necessity. First of all, do you agree with this idea? And secondly, as he said that this is going to bring a major shift or some sort of realignment. Do you think that, with the way Iranians are able to hold out against the Americans, it's going to end up in some sort of embarrassment for the Americans and Israelis? And if that happens, will that be the major milestone in this, I would say, process where we see the decline of the West? And my third question too is that what are the three most likely scenarios for Iran over the next 6 to 12 months?
Start with the question of choice, the fulcrum question of choice. And well, it's how you read the semantics into it. I do not agree that there was something on the table, and as Badr al-Busayri on that fateful Friday evening, 28th February, just hours before the invasion started on Saturday morning, February 27th, Friday, gave that disastrous CBS evening news. And he said that the inspectors would be in Tehran in 3 months' time, and there is light at the end of the tunnel, and so on and so forth. I'd not buy into that rather cheerful approach that he painted. But he's a diplomat, so he has to put on that picture. From my understanding is that the Americans did offer to Tehran, for example, civilian nuclear fuel supplies, and that we would assure and underwrite that to you. Even factoring in the aspect that Iran does have an energy crunch, climate change questions, oil is rationed in Iran, petrol is rationed in Iran for one thing. The irony of it, despite being a OPEC leading producer and exporter. There are also questions of dams running dry with a 6-year drought that has taken place. So the question of civilian nuclear fuel for energy requirements is a perfectly acceptable point within a constricted sphere. And the Americans did say, we will assure you that so long as you cap your actual weaponization program and the enrichment, which leads to weaponization, because it had not yet reached that. 60% of it, of the 440.9 kilos U-235 enrichment that is in the stockpile, now in the rubble, for instance. If taken to 90%, and it could have been done very rapidly because the window period had come down to practically 0%. And I'll come to that in a moment too with the JCPOA bit. That was put to the Iranians. Arakchi stonewalled that. Foreign Minister Arakchi, no, we cannot accept that. Now that's a question of national pride, chauvinism and all of that. Yes, okay, fine. But he did not accept it. Will you stop funding regional proxies across the region who create murder and mayhem for all concerned, GCC and non-GCC across the Arabian Peninsula? They said no to that too. So obviously you have to factor that in, which is not being discussed as to why then Washington and Jerusalem went in for the air campaign as a replay of the 12-day war of June 2025. Both these factors have not been mentioned. And Badr al-Busayri, quite frankly, diplomats being diplomats, they're not scholars, have to be economical with the truth. And that is precisely what he was on that evening CBS interview. And I think it was quite frankly embarrassing that Oman even sent him for that interview in the first place. Then we come to the question of the JCPOA. It had constricted Iran with an eagle-eyed attitude to 3.67% enrichment. And yes, Tehran was adhering to that. No disputing that aspect, Abhinav. But then you take a very literalist, lawyerly approach to the reading of the contract. And indeed, it was thick with legalese and jargon, the entire JCPOA bit, when it went into effect in July 2015. This is year 11 of the JCPOA, had it continued 2026. By this time, Iran would have been on second and third generation advanced centrifuges, and indeed it already is, not the older tubes as such, by which, and it was permitted by the JCPOA to do that, it would have increased its stockpile, not quite weapons grade, but the actual stockpile per se would have increased to quite a disquieting level, and the Obama administration knew about it. They had factored that in, and that there was nothing we could do about it. So, and this is what even Foreign Secretary John Kerry, Senator Kerry, back then, who was part of the talks, had conceded privately. And even after the outgoing Obama administration, that there's nothing we can do about that bit. That is the sunset clause bit. That was the breakdown point that with each passing year, Abhinav, the window would have contracted for Iran's pile. Yes, there was a proviso for shipping out the Fordo facility enrichment mass to Putin's Russia. That was in place too. Granted, even that aspect, I'm not shielding the facts. But The sunset clause was the matter that at what point does Iran completely break free? And it was writing on the wall. By year 8 of the treaty, had it still been in effect, 2023, Iran was able to purchase weapons and missiles on the international market, and all sanctions would have been lifted. I mean, the irony of that and its grim consequences as we speak now should be evident, that Iran would have been able, never mind to indigenously develop its projectiles, which it already has, as we know, and firing on its GCC neighbors, but it would have been able to purchase on the international market from Western suppliers. That waiver had been given by the JCPOA too. I mean, talk about being disastrous and lack of foresight. So there were issues with the JCPOA. You can complain till kingdom come about Trump and his personal access to grind with Obama and his personal ego and the bluster and the rhetoric and all of that. And he wanted a better deal and he's obsessed with deals and all that. Yes, you can throw all that at the man, but intrinsically, there were major issues with the JCPOA. And I've given you just 2 to 3 salient examples to prove why only a literalist reading of it would not prevent us from getting to where problems would have happened with Iran as such. So that was that. So I've covered the bit about the Muscat talks and the Vienna talks that took place before the war started, and this. Yes, I agree with the previous speaker that there is a false hope that bombing can submit a population. I believe the State Department should have done more homework in noting that there is no Delcy Rodriguez waiting in the wing. And quite frankly, the Americans have factored that in because Trump is on record stating that Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, exiled crown prince, is a nice guy, but he's not exactly cut out for the job. Just as he said for Maria Machado, the Nobel laureate. So the Americans are not that naive as people tend to make them out to be. He is pretty sanguine about the fact that neither of them really cuts it. Having said that, the Iranian opposition is pathetic in the diaspora. It is far too hyper-individualistic, far too fractious. They don't know what they want. There's no sense of unity. And that in no mean measure has been capitalized by the regime in Tehran to continue its oppressive run on its own population, because there is nothing really to counter them. You have the MEK, which is thoroughly discredited as an Islamo-Marxist organization, but is being played up by individuals in the West and by Israel, of course, to a certain extent, because, of course, some elements in the West feel grateful to the MEK because they were the ones who first spilled the beans in 2002 that Iran has a surreptitious nuclear program despite being an NPT signatory. But the NPT stands thoroughly discredited, having supported Saddam during the war, egging him on to fight and to create murder and mayhem across the 8 years of that bloody conflict, one of the worst in the late 20th century. So they do have some supporters within Iran, no question about it, and quite a few in the diaspora, just as you have the royalists. The left in Iran has practically decimated after the last pogrom took place of it under Khomeiни's regime in 1983. That was vestiges of the Tudeh party that was referred to as Mossadegh's party and the rest. So there is no so-called progressive left opposition, in any case left as such, within the Iranian domestic landscape. The point was that if some action could be taken from abroad, it could stir the Iranian population. But then the paradox and the problem here is this. The regime over 47 years has honed its skills in murdering its own population in cold blood, which is why you see they've been currently cowed after the most recent bout. And the most recent bout, interestingly, must be noted for these features. All 31 provinces were rocked by riots this time. Daily necessities riots is what they were in December and January 2025. With the currency in free fall, banks collapsing, and in food inflation, which in December, January was 82.2%. At the end of March, today, now it's 112.5% year-on-year food inflation. And general inflation, the annual inflation rate now is 50.6%. So we saw that with all 31 provinces, and what happened in the last bout is that even the traditional working class and lower middle class Shias, who may not necessarily have participated in earlier protests, say for the Zan Zendagi women's protests of September 2022 of the Masa Amini riots, or the ones of the student protests which go back to July 1999, or the stolen vote protests of Green Movement, the Ahmadinejad second tenure of 2009. This time we saw even these pious Shia traditional lower middle and working classes join in because they saw their savings evaporate overnight. And the regime has nothing to offer them who were hitherto had a semblance of fidelity to the regime, like the Bazari classes and the others, the devout as it were. They're not the North Tehran's cafe crowd who wanted greater social liberties that we see in the previous riots, like the Gen Z, wired young population as such. This time it was those who don't necessarily have lattes in North Tehran, in Shemiran cafes and so on and so forth. They were the ones who joined this time. And now they are in mourning for their bereaved. And you will see, of course, not now, because the security forces have clamped down so effectively on them. People can't come out of the streets to protest. The moment you come out of a building, you have to identify to someone on the street, what are you here for, with your ID and pass and so on and so forth. So when you see these pro-regime rallies taking place, which is covered by Western media naively, it is the 20 to 25% who has benefited by the establishment. And of course, the most banal of reasons, they have permission to go out in the streets to protest. Can we please accept that? If nothing else, it should be common sense and writing on the wall. They have permission to go out in the streets when others don't have permission to do so. It is they who are out on the street, not the main population. But then, as I put it again, how long are you going to cow a population with 112.5% food inflation, with 19 dams practically running dry across Iran due to sheer mismanagement and the stupidity of the government and its so-called economic managers? Not that the 6-year drought over the past few years has helped, but these are issues. And yes, a mention was made of climate change, which is absolutely paramount and may even be one of the factors which would take out this regime in eventual time. No question about it. It's writing on the wall. So that needs to be pointed out. Then there is the question of who benefits. The IRGC with the killings that have taken place and the removal of the leadership. What has happened, and I will conclude here in my opening remarks, is this, that Iran has become another Pakistan. I do not wish to drive home the analogy to an extreme, but by that I mean that the IRGC has become a state within a state, and it is calling the shots and is going to do so for times to come if the regime survives. And this is something I have said previously on your webinars to some extent and elsewhere too. Had Khamenei died a natural death through cancer, which was in any case in remission, by the by, the IRGC still would have come to power, and they would be calling the shots and shunting the clerics to a backseat. They would have kept the pious veneer of a Islamic Republic regime, which incidentally celebrated the founding of the Islamic Republic yesterday on April 1st, when it was officially announced in 1979 after the plebiscite, if you must know. But the Revolutionary Guards, the Praetorian Guards, will take front, right, and center, just as the Pakistan Army does, the Fauji and Shaheen foundations do, in controlling the economy and the levers of power in Pakistan. It is the IRGC because, as your previous speaker rightly put it, they see themselves as the true defenders of the revolution, since the armed forces have never traditionally been trusted. The IRGC came into effect as a body on 5th May 1979 as doctrinaire foot soldiers of the regime. They're like the Nazi brown shirts. It's as simple as that. They're not a professional fighting force, which the old regime of Pahlavi Iran came into being with the Islamic Republic, the Artesh, the traditional tri-services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They are looked upon, they are professional, by the by, and Khamenei and others down the line always looked at them with suspicion that they were tainted by the previous regime. And that's why you have this parallel force that was given permission to build up, which saw action during the 8-year war to defend Iran. And when they returned, when war concluded, Abhinav, and I'll stop here, in August 88, they wanted something back in return. Khamenei died within a year in June 89. Khamenei died, and Khamenei obviously felt obliged to let them take a greater say in national matters. And that is why you find today the IRGC having percolated through all aspects of life. And, over half a century, they call the shots, and they are the security intelligence apparatus of the regime, and which has honed its skills over 47 years in suppressing its population. I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Burzin, for your remarks. We'll come back to you with questions. But before that, I'll go to Ambassador Bhattacharya, sir. We have very interesting questions for you. So we saw that, after Khamenei's death, many people complained that India did not condemn the death. And many in India, but even the government's official stand is also that India has robust civilizational ties with Iran. But India has increasingly found it difficult to navigate this tightrope balancing between Israel and Iran. But today, whether we agree or not, but generally India is perceived as closer to Israel and to the US circle. So how do you look at India's overall stance? You know? And secondly, do these narratives of resistance and are they going to impact the radicalized, I would say, Islamist terrorist groups or the organizations in South Asia after this war?
Thank you for bringing me into the conversation, Abhinav. I think before I respond to your comments, I wanted to make a few general remarks about what I call a very unfortunate war. And I call it unfortunate because this was not necessary. I think there have been three fatal flaws in the invasion of Iran by Israel and the United States. The first, the invasion itself. There was much more scope for diplomacy. I do not agree with Burzin. I kind of go along with what Imad was suggesting, but a lot more effort was required to be put in, which was not. It was sabotaged at a certain point. The second point that I think is very unfortunate is this presumption that a regime will fall or that a fall of a regime can bring about a change. I can understand power politics, and this is quite natural in the world that I inhabit because I come from the world of diplomacy, not of academics, and I can understand that fully. But to presume that a regime is going to fall of a civilization harks a basic misunderstanding of what Iran actually is. That is not to say that the regime may not fall tomorrow, but in my sense, I think what has happened is that it has entrenched the regime much further. The 12-day war last year entrenched the regime in a much more considerate manner. And I think in some ways it gave much more fuel to the more conservative elements within that particular system. And I think this was a very unfortunate miscalculation, if I may put it that way. The third unfortunate part is this belief that there can be a process of assassination of the political and state leadership, which can lead to a certain change. This is again a miscalculation, not understanding how the system revolves, and to presume that this is the way that one can carry on a particular agenda is to set loose a very dangerous precedent in a very dangerous neighborhood. I'm talking of West Asia. Given that, I think there have been miscalculations on Iran's part as well, which bear mention before I come to your point about how India looks at it. I think on Iran's part, they face this basic asymmetry of technology vis-a-vis the US, Israel combined, because in terms of technology, there's no way that the Iranians can combat it. And to call for a reduction of their missile forces is something that's always going to be a no-starter for the Iranians, because that's the only force. I mean, if the Iranians were to say that Israel or the United States should take away its fleet presence in that region or take away its air force, would that be acceptable to anyone? So I think one has to be realistic in the world of diplomacy. Otherwise, we go back to the Stone Age and we throw stones at each other and try and win a war. I think the attack on the Gulf states was also something that was most unfortunate, because there was a certain sense of rapprochement between the north and the south of the Gulf, and in some ways, this has probably received a bit of a setback. But I don't buy the argument that there is actually a very sharp schism between the Iranian or the Shia factions and the Sunni factions. I think there is much greater understanding in that particular front than we normally tend to believe in the Western intelligentsia circles and their writings. Given that, let me now come to India. I think over the last couple of decades, we have had the fortune of building our relations with Israel in particular, which has been a very strong point to the extent that today we have a commonality of interests and purpose, and the level of trust and confidence in each other is at a peak. And I think in that particular context, even this war is not going to change that particular aspect of it. That does not mean that our relations with Iran, which actually go back to civilizational contacts, and despite the fact that we've had differences, and we have differences with many countries over various issues, and so our relations with Iran not only go back to civilizational times, but actually have a modern context as well. And I think a lot of the projects that we were working on, which have an impact not only on bilateral, but also on the regional issues, have been impacted in this particular instance, just as some of the very major initiatives that we have with Israel have been impacted because of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which is still ongoing in a sense, unfortunately, again. And so conflicts are not the thing to be done today. And I think we need to have these people understand, and I'm referring to both the leadership on the US-Israeli side as well as the Iranian side, that the wars are not the way ahead. You need to get back to the table and sort it out. You can't get it all. Negotiations mean that you cannot get it all. And to presume that you can get it through a war is as erroneous in my understanding. And it is more destructive. It destroys the people. It destroys their livelihood. It develops a sense of vengeance, or maybe the Iranians called it resistance. I suspect that in this particular context, the divide between the United States and Israel will sharpen. And I think that is very unfortunate. I think divide between the Gulf states and Israel will sharpen. And that is again very unfortunate, because I've been a great advocate of the Abraham Accords and what it meant in terms of the future of that region. And I think a lot of the Gulf states had bought into that particular idea. So I think in many ways, this war has been extremely damaging for Israel in particular, which is our closest strategic partner in that region. It has also been damaging for Iran, because the kind of death and destruction that has happened, the recovery that it will need to have, but what it has done in a very ironical manner is that it has increased the resolve of the people. And I think we will now find the need for more negotiated settlements, because this will not reach an end through this particular process of a war. And if there has to be an end game, either from Jerusalem, Washington, D.C., or from Tehran, there has to be a negotiated option. I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhattacharya. So now we'll open the house for the questions. So I have a question which is addressed to all three speakers, basically. Do you think that, Ambassador Bhattacharya, you have been in Turkey, and in the recent past we saw that Turkey is very close to Pakistan. Turkey is very close to Saudis also, and with the way this war is unfolding, it seems that the Americans are going to weaken in the Middle East. And do you think that after this, will it open some window for the rise of Islamic NATO?
I think these are separate agenda, and the agenda of Turkey and Saudi Arabia are not exactly the same. And you know this very well, Abhinav, because you've done a lot of research on this too. So the agenda of Turkey is another kind of leadership of the Ummah as compared to the leadership of the Ummah by the custodians of Makkah, Medina. And there is yet another, which is the leadership of yet another Ummah, which is coming from Tehran and, has inspiration in various other parts of West Asia as well. So I don't think this is going to be a cause for the rise of Islamic sectarianism. I think there has been this trend of radical Islam, and I think we need to be conscious of the fact of the role and interplay of the Muslim Brotherhood in all this. And in some ways, I think what you saw in you know in the Hamas operations were more Muslim Brotherhood than the kind of connect that we often draw with West Asia, with Tehran, for instance. I think we need to be mindful of that. I don't think this is going to have this particular instance is going to have an impact on South Asia, but the agenda on South Asia has been ongoing for some time, and we are mindful of that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Just a few, I would say, developments that I have come across. I would just like to bring it to notice. This the regime in Tehran also maintains ties with Al Qaeda, with Muslim Brotherhood. So here, I think in this case, the Shia-Sunni divide is not as prominent as it is made out to be. Besides that, let's say if America weakens in the Middle East, or if Israel weakens in the Middle East, even the Arab states would be compelled to rethink, because if the credibility of the West declines, I think they will have to reevaluate their security calculus. And maybe if that impels them to move towards an Islamic NATO kind of a thing. So that was my point. And regarding Turkey and Saudis, so I know that there are differences between like what they want to pursue, but lately we have seen some convergence between the Turkey and Saudis, particularly as far as the overseas engagements are concerned. Let's say in Africa or even in the Middle East, they're looking to maintain stability, even if it requires engaging with the Islamist forces and Islamist governments. So I was mentioning in that context. Anyways, I mean, if you want to make a comment on this, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll
No, I
request the
would
other two
like
speakers
to
also
kind
to
of
make.
wait in on that a little bit. I think you're right. In that particular context, the kind of connect that we saw of the Muslim Brotherhood and the revolution, the Iranian Revolution of '79, and how they had combined forces together is something that, the academics would have much more information on. But that has always played a particular role. So let's not discount that. Let's also not forget that, in Syria today, we have a leader who is or was a member of the terrorist association. So there are links between the Sunni factions out of various countries with certain new leaderships as well. So I think that's not it goes both ways, and they're all very pragmatic people. If you can get them on a table, you can actually come to some kind of a conclusion, and that's why I think that on this particular instance, in the negotiations with Iran, it was very unfortunate. I wanted to kind of mention a small bit about the power balance, geopolitics, in the United States in that region. I know that the Iranians have been calling out very loudly for the Americans to leave. I don't think that is particularly what they would wish to see, because despite the fact that there are the expectation that somebody else can fill in, there really is nobody. And I think the Saudis and the Gulf states also know that very well. So the Americans are going to stay there whether they like it or not. The cost may be higher that the Gulf states would have to pay to keep the Americans over there. But that's part of the process, because I don't think at this particular point of time, either the Chinese or the Russians have the capacity or the willingness or the ability to come in and replace. I think in some of the strategic areas, not in terms of deployments, the Chinese and the Russians would become more present. But I think that's about the extent to which they will go. But the old relations will continue.
Thank you. Thank you. Burzin, just please, I'll request you to make your comment. And also, if you can mention briefly, because you have studied about the radical Islamist groups in South Asia. So I also request you to share some observations in brief about the impact of this war on the radical Islamist organizations in South Asia. And I guess recently there were some, I would say, updates about IRGC getting active in the northeastern part of, I would say, neighborhood of India. So maybe you can just throw some light on that. After that, I'll go to Mr. Imad.
I agree with the ambassador that Moscow and Beijing are not going to necessarily get involved, because China doesn't do domestic entanglements in any part of the world. They just want to get on with the mercantile aspect and making money, bluntly put. Sino-Saudi trade as of 2024 stood at $105.4 billion. And even as that will never unwind or lessen, I'm sure it's not lost on Riyadh, never mind Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, and others, that the Chinese have supplied Tehran with real-time data for striking American assets in the region. That is not lost on the GCC, and the Arabs are not one to forget things. Likewise with Putin, who has also provided intel to Tehran on these aspects. So all of the GCC will be keeping that in mind once the dust settles, however it does, and I do not know how it portends and ends. I'm a historian, I'm not a futurologist, but you can be sure of that. And there is no question of the GCC or Arab countries necessarily seeking either a BRICS umbrella or an SCO umbrella or any of that thing for support geostrategically or even for defense requirements anytime soon to either of these powers. They will continue with US, and mind you, yes, the US may have dragged them into this war as one wants to put it, but at the same time, the US has delivered the goods and it has protected them. So that needs to be put into context too. Israel will be unpopular for quite a while in the region. Be that as it may, the point is, a mention was made of Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, which is the sovereign right of any country for deterrence. Who's denying that? But do you have a right to go and fire them and create murder and mayhem and proxies all across the region? That is what has been a headache. And Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, mentioned in the last week as the talks were in Vienna, that at some point, this is before the war when one didn't realize the war was going to take place on that Saturday morning, as you know, Hakan Fidan mentioned that so much for Islamic NATO and all, Abhinav, he stated at some point, all of us need to sit with Tehran and thrash out as to this whole missile arsenal bit of theirs, because it's a clear and present danger to all of us, never mind just the GCC. So the Muslim world had an issue with Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. And speaking of that arsenal, what happened in Pakistan January 2024? People tend to forget basic facts when Iran fired drones and missiles into Balochistan province on 16, 17, and 18 January 2024. So that arsenal was never exclusively developed with Israel in mind. What else is, and that's just come up to Pakistan. Let's come to India, or should I say east of India. What is the IRGC doing in Burma? Having supplied urea and jet fuel to the military junta for the bombing campaign for the last 15 months that has been underwritten by the IRGC. Does India know that the IRGC is on its eastern borders as well? It's already on the western border with what happened to Pakistan. And of course, the Pakistanis may paper it because Raisi in April 2024, one of his last state visits, came to Karachi and Lahore. And that was a sort of damage control visit after what happened in January, in the middle of the October 7th war that I just mentioned about these missile and drone strikes in Pakistan. Talking about the Shia-Sunni interface, Pakistan will have a tough time, even as a mediator with these talks, because it has to balance out its relations with Riyadh, but also Tehran in one sense. It shares a coterminous border with Tehran, a 900-kilometer border, and a very porous one at that, which is not properly mined, which explains why 40% of petrol in Balochistan and Quetta is smuggled in from Iran. So that tells you how much Pakistan has control over its own border bit. Not to mention drugs and the arms racket, and a restive province of Sunnis, Balochis on both sides, whether Iran's Sistan by Balochistan province, but also Pakistan's namesake Balochistan province, and both capitals trade charges of supporting dissidents and irredentists as such. Then you have Pakistan stepping up to the plate and supplying Riyadh with secondment battalions and the rest of it, and some weaponry, which has been spoken about in this so-called Islamic NATO thing. But Pakistan will always have to walk a tightrope on that with a 15% voluble, vocal, basically disgruntled Ithna Ashari, 12er Shia population at home. Make no mistake about it, because the Shia population in Pakistan does feel subtly, not overtly, but subtly discriminated by what is an overwhelmingly Sunni establishment. These things are never spoken about. It's always shoved under the carpet because Muslims being Muslims, they like to paper over such aspects and not talk about these ugly bits. Well, I'm doing so as an academic because I believe that's what scholarship is about. So Pakistan will always have this problem with its Shia element. It will have to bear it in mind in its dealings with Riyadh, which also explains why Pakistan politely rebuffed Riyadh in 2015 April to send troops at the height of the Yemen civil war conflict. It did not do so, if you remember. So today, Pakistan is willing to send troops to Riyadh, but in April they had to politely tell Riyadh no, and that's quite something for Pakistan to say no to either China or Saudi Arabia for anything. Remember that. But it took a massive effort. But the very fact that it did do so tells you how ground realities bite. It simply could not afford to upset its own Shia population at home because the Houthis are Zaidi Shia. They are fiber Shias. They're not 12 Ithna Ashari as the Iranian Shias are, or the 7 Ismaili Shias, but they're Shia nevertheless. And Pakistan could not be afford to be seen as stoking sectarianism, given that sectarianism is a bane of the Pakistani political landscape with regular Shia Sunni riots that we see happening all the time. And finally, what about that Chinese brokered Saudi-Iranian rapprochement of 2023? I never bought into it back then, and now it lies in tatters with what's happened as such. So it's all cosmetic with what the Chinese do. Talk is cheap, and so is rhetoric. But the Chinese will never put their money where their mouth is because they do not want to see themselves in any such entanglements. Which also explains why the Chinese do encourage Pakistan against India, but at the same time, they have a measured approach in their foreign policy towards India too, not to keel over entirely towards Pakistan. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Ahmad, now the question for you. First, how do you look at the end? I mean, is there still a hope for negotiated settlement or some kind of, I would say, lasting peace, or all this exercise of ceasefire being discussed, this is just a deception from both the sides? Because if you come to know that in Iran, there are multiple leadership quarters, as in the President Pezeshkian, he's one of the liberal voices, and he doesn't have a say in ending or beginning a war. On the IRGC front, there are very strong hardliners like Mr. Wahid who are controlling the scenario, Mr. Muhammad Ghalibaf. They constitute the hardline faction. So do you think that, with all these people in place and in the charge of the situation, there is still a hope for negotiated settlement? And secondly, if at all, let's say a settlement, some sort of lasting peace, some sort of temporary peace comes, is there any possibility of the people of Iran rising up in revolt again?
All right, wow. I have so many comments from all the interventions. I will do my best to answer your question as well, but I have to mention a couple of things.
Yeah, sure.
Forgive me. It makes it seem like Iran is the aggressor here. I mean, first of all, that's why I say it's a war of choice by the United States and Israel. And the casualty is not just the civilian casualties, but also diplomacy and international law and the power structure institutions that were built following the Second World War. So we don't end up where we are right now in the Iran war. So the United States and Israel have crossed every red line. These are not just targeting, it makes it very sanitized to say we're targeting Iranian leadership. It's called murder and assassination of, leadership in Iran. We got to call it that because that's what's happening. When US dropped those massive bombs on Iranian civilian nuclear facilities that at the time, last June, were still under IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency supervision and inspections, it's another major line, red line, that is being crossed. We've got to put this in context, that no matter what you think of the Iranian government, you like them, you don't like them, don't worry, I don't like them either. But it doesn't give right or justify the way the United States, by being a belligerent power, an arrogant power, and Israel as a regional belligerent power that has already inflicted so much harm to the Palestinians, to the Lebanese, to the Syrians, the list goes on. You cannot avoid that reality. And so we've got to understand this, that Iran By the way, I was in Geneva for the third round of the negotiations between US and Iran. And I have to, push back on that Iran didn't make concessions and there was no deal. There was. It was a US decision not to take it. And Witkoff and Kushner came to Washington, and the decision by the hawks in Washington was that we're going to go to war. But there was a diplomatic off-ramp available. There was, and I know it. And the JCPOA, by the way, it functioned as a multilateral agreement. It wasn't just US and Iran. And so it didn't die with the US pulling out. It just went into, hibernation because a big pillar of it was taken away. And Iran continued to commit to that agreement until a year after Trump pulled out of that deal in 2018. This is important because we had 24-hour monitoring of Iran's nuclear facilities under that deal. If the basis and the excuse for this war is that if Iran is close to a nuclear weapon, that's been a mantra of Netanyahu for the past 20 years, that Iran is a week away, a month away from nuclear weapons. If Iran made the decision to build a nuclear weapon, like the Pakistanis, after India tested its nuclear weapon, and the Pakistanis mentioned, we will eat grass until we have a deterrence, Iran could have done the same. It was about a decision. And that decision rested on Khamenei's fatwa and his leadership until, by the way, the Americans murdered him with the Israelis. And that removed the fatwa with him. And in these conditions, actually, this war has brought the calculations and the questions in Tehran whether we've taken sanctions, we've taken assassinations, we've taken sabotage, we've taken international isolation, all of these economic, social costs of being under sanctions for a nation that, mind you, under the IAEA is a signator to a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. There's only 4 in the world who are not: India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. And so Iran is still within that agreement of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. These are important information and facts on the ground that we need to keep mind of. And then, mind you, this is crazy. All the billions, half of US military exports goes to the Middle East. Okay, and they're the biggest sellers of weapons around the world. Half of it goes to the Middle East. Dubai, with a couple of strikes by Iran, Dubai is finished. Bye-bye Dubai. Their economy, their ability to rebound as a safe haven for capital, tax, haven for the rich and the powerful is no longer valid. That security aura is broken. And that's broken because of how Iran views the GCC countries in different degrees in their role in this war. And so, but I want to end on this by saying that all of that security, building the largest military bases in the Middle East, from Bahrain for the naval to Qatar for the Air Force of the United States, has not shielded those countries from Iranian drones and missiles. So, actually, the Qatari foreign minister was precise and correct by saying that at the end of this war, we cannot not engage with Iran because geography is permanent. The US is thousands of kilometers away. And this war shows how much they actually care about their Arab allies and the GCC by taking, or even the Ukraine-Russia war, or their military alliances with South Korea, taking Patriot missiles and bringing them to the Middle East to protect Israel and US, not Gulf countries. So the GCC is actually viewing this, ironically, as a byproduct of this war, that ultimately their security lies in the security of the other. So they cannot contain their own security by watching Iran become insecure, unstable. So it will lead not to an Islamic NATO. I think that's the wrong reality to label it like that. It requires a regional security apparatus where these countries can come together and discuss their security concerns. And there is a forum for that, if you want to know. because that's now my other leg of work on weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. There are currently 6 years in a row negotiations happening in New York at the highest level at the UN headquarters with the involvement of 23 out of 24 countries of the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, but their seat is in the room, with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, with the exception of the United States, but the seat is available in the room, and international organizations and key civil society organizations, including Middle East Treaty Organization, that are working on drafting and then agreeing on a freely arrived at consensus-based agreement to eradicate and limit and get rid of weapons of mass destruction that includes chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and their means of delivery in the Middle East. So there is already a forum where we can discuss these security concerns, because the war in Israel and America inflicted on Iran is no longer a war limited to them. It is regional and global, and therefore the solutions and the backings for an off-ramp cannot happen between just Israel, Iran, and US, moderated, facilitated by Pakistan or whoever else. It requires a regional sit-down that addresses not only the concerns and the views and what's happening in Iran in this war, but also what's the question of Palestine, the question of Yemen, the question of Libya, the question of Syria, the question of Israel. So if we want collective security, it requires a collective discussion, and the collective discussion can happen in a forum seen as a ground in which we can actually have those conversations without killing each other. And currently, that forum exists within the framework of the United Nations. And hopefully, in the aftermath of this war, the GCC, along with the rest of the region, realize that they cannot buy their security at the behest of a foreign power that ultimately doesn't have their interests at heart. It has their own. And so this question is not just for Tehran and Riyadh, it's also for Jerusalem. Because Israel will have to reckon with the fact that it has burned every bridge with its neighboring countries. And what has inflicted on the Palestinians will be causing further extremism, anti-Semitism, and this notion that Ambassador mentioned, the vengefulness that we can call resistance, but vengefulness will continue. And to break that cycle is to realize that you can build whatever walls you want. You can have the best technologies you want. You can have the backing of the sole superpower you want. But you know what? I am with my colleagues on a daily basis in contact, both in Israel, in Jordan, in Iran, and elsewhere. And I'm telling you, when I speak to my colleagues in Israel, it's the size of New Jersey. I don't know what the equivalent is for India, but Israel is small. And 10 million people with a few missiles have to go to bomb shelters, day in, day out. Not necessarily casualties, but the breaking of their ability to function, the mental stress. All of that is also a factor. Even with all of this enormous security apparatus they've built for themselves, for their own protection, it cannot buy their security. Violence begets violence. Insecurity begets insecurity. So ultimately, at the end of all of this, and that includes, to your question, that in the aftermath, yes, there is off-ramps. I'm just giving you one forum, but there's many others. And I hope that we can find a way on a ceasefire. Let me make a big distinction here. Iran is not seeking a ceasefire. It's seeking an end to war and aggression. And this, by the way, is a litmus test for the rest of the world. If an aggressor like the United States and Israel can do this to another sovereign state, mind you, others are in line. If we want to sort out our problems like this, we're in deep, deep trouble. So this is a reason why Iran is not seeking a ceasefire, because twice it's been fooled. Amidst negotiations, US and Israel have opted for military option. So it wants a guarantee, and that guarantee comes through a non-aggression pact. It has to come within the framework of the UN Security Council. It has to include the regional countries, and ultimately to a beginning of an already existing resolutions and other mandates that require a need for a region that is the most unstable to actually have a regional security agreement like NATO, like the ASEAN, OSCE, you name it, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These are all different organizations that give us the framing that is necessary for the Middle East that is, ironically, doesn't have a regional security apparatus. And when it comes to the Iranian people, you know what? Let me tell you the truth. I hope in the aftermath of this, because when you speak to people on the streets and look around even in India, people know it deep down that this was an aggressor, is a bully. The US and Israel is a bully. Doesn't matter if it's Iran in this case. This act of bulliness makes you feel bitter. You hoot Iran. You're glad that Iran can actually answer finally these aggressions and this arrogance. And this is to show to the rest of the world that we cannot just bow down and cow down to aggression by the United States. And I hope that the Indian foreign policy reorientation will take into account this, because the masses, like it or not, are with the Iranian people and are hooting for some form of justice in this inequality that is happening. And I will end by saying that may this be the beginning of a spring, not just for the Iranian people, that may result in changes in Iran, but across the region. At the end of this war, Iran would have made Trump administration a lame duck presidency when they lose the Congress in the primaries that is coming up. And it will be the end of the Netanyahu government, because they have just chewed on way bigger than they can. And I hope that across the region, there's a rethinking of centering security on human and environmental security, and not through the narrow lens of military and state in terms of, government security, that sometimes, and in most cases, is a divide and a huge gap on the needs of the people versus the governments that rule them. So with that, I hope that this war ends and the misery ends, and with the spring, may that bring new blossoms and new ways that we can address our conflicts, because conflict in its essence is not an anomaly. We have it within us, amongst us, and among nations. But the way we resolve them, we have evolved to ways to address them. And there are many non-violent mechanisms and ways we can address our concerns and our conflicts. And may we be wise enough that in the future, we are able to do that and exhaust that before we even utter the words of war for resolving our difference, because it's not anymore necessary. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imad, for your most insightful remarks. I think with this, we come to the end of our today's session, though we had one question from Mr. Irshad, but I think the question has more or less been answered by almost all our panelists. This was about the erosion of US-led security guarantees and the increased vulnerability of Gulf states, influencing the prospects of Pakistan-Turkey Gulf alignment and its implications for regional stability. So I guess we discussed about the so-called Islamic NATO, the impact of the war and its spillover in the region and beyond the region. So I guess more or less the question has already been answered. So we heard...
just one remark, Abhinav, if I may. I agree with the last speaker that this framing of Islamic NATO is more bluster and less action, because remember, at the end of the day, all of the said elements, the Muslim countries involved have their own individual agendas and foreign policies too, and inevitably there will be conflict by having some sort of collective security arrangement, which may fly in the face of their own strategic autonomy. That cannot be ruled out. I mean, when we talk about global South arrangements like BRICS or the SCO, to give two stark examples of talking shops, and that is precisely what they are, nothing more, nothing less than talking shops. What exactly do they achieve in terms of a collective purpose? Nothing, quite frankly, because each one has their own agenda, and each one is called, with the Chinese pretty much calling the shots for both the SCO and BRICS that way. So that needs to be pointed out too. And if anything, the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, has had nothing to say about what's happened to these GCC partners. And that too is, in more ways than one, has always been something of a talking shop, which most Muslims would bitterly and privately concede. So this question of Islamic NATO is more pie in the sky thinking than will fructify in times to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Burzi. So with this, we come to the end of our today's session. Definitely the issues that we discussed today, they're most critical, and we had some of the most distinguished and insightful experts on the subject today. My heartfelt and sincere thanks to all of you for bringing out various perspectives and in fact, I agree that these issues are very complex and they need to be looked at from various angles. And we saw that our speakers had different viewpoints and they addressed different perspectives. They tried to explain things from various, I would say, angles, which is very essential to enhance the understanding of I would say, geopolitics, a student of geopolitics like me, and also our audience. And it seems that the world order today, the geopolitics today, has become like a complex maze, something which we prefer to refer to as Chakravyuh in the Indian mythology. And this is getting more and more complex and layered as the time passes. And it seems that our present multilateral institutions, structures, rules, norms, and I would say the values are not able to find out lasting solutions to navigate this complex maze, and it's getting deeper and deeper. So I mean, I think that the war has left the region more destabilized, though by decapitating the leadership, the countries like Israel and the US were looking for solutions. But after what we have seen over the last 1 month, we are left with Iran, which is much more, I would say, a leadership which is much more hardcore, much more radical, and it has exposed the vulnerabilities of the West. Also, the choke points like Straits of Hormuz, if they get blocked and if they get threatened with these things, the whole economics and the energy supply lines of the global world, I would say, they get badly impacted. And it has shown how extremely vulnerable all of us as human society are. And we are living in a very interconnected world today. So we are left with a very complex situation, a very highly destabilized region. Definitely, people may agree or disagree with me, but personally, I feel that I mean, we are all hoping for a negotiated settlement to come out, but it seems that that sort of settlement is a bit far. And certainly, I mean, even if there is some kind of a temporary relief or a temporary, I would say, modus vivendi understanding to come to a halt, perhaps, I mean, we are still left with chances, we are still left with the possibilities of this conflict, I would say, flaring up again in the future. And it's not just about these three countries, it's about the entire region, and also the powers beyond the region, particularly China and Russia. Maybe this conflict is the part of the larger geopolitical chessboard in which we see the challenge coming to the Western led world order from revisionist, or let's say from the upcoming countries like China and Russia and the global south. Maybe this whole thing which is unfolding in the West Asia is the part, is a small chapter in this larger process that we are seeing at the much higher level. Hopefully the peace prevails, and we hope for peace. We hope for, as Mr. Imad said, that we hope that the words like war and aggression are never repeated again. So let's hope for the best. Once again, thanks all of you. Thanks, Mr. Burzin. Thanks, Mr. Imad. Thanks, Ambassador Bhattacharya, for your most insightful remarks. And my heartfelt thanks to all our audience. We look forward to inviting you more often in the future. And let's see what developments unfold in the next 1 month. Perhaps we can get together once again after a month and discuss these. Thank you very much. Namaskar. Thank you.